Meridith, let me start with you. And Pence running, as Ali just said, as Trump without Trump. Does that work? Is that, well, he hasn't announced yet. If he does, that's how he seems to be selling himself. Does that work?
Well, for a lot of these Republicans who have already gotten in, people like Nikki Haley, or who might be like Mike Pence, it's going to be hard for them to try to define themselves as somebody or as having different policies other than Trump. Nikki Haley worked under Trump. She was recruited by him to join the UN. Of course, like Pence was his vice president. We have seen some ways that they have differentiated themselves, one of them being Ukraine, the other entitlement reform, but really how they're able to try to carve out their own path is something that will be interesting to see.
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, in some context, the question becomes, does the Reagan-era Republican still exist? In some ways, you see former Vice President Pence trying to cast himself in that light, yes, in that image. Nikki Haley as well. Is this going to be sort of a battle between the traditional conservative Republican versus the progressive, or I shouldn't say progressive, the Trump and Ron DeSantis branch of the party, which is more populist, is the word I'm looking for. Thank you.
It could be. I mean, look, I'm not sure we have any idea what Nikki Haley's running on at this point. I mean, she's basically spent a week and a half trying to not talk about policy issues and just make nice with Donald Trump. I mean, I actually would take sort of the premise of the question from Ali a little bit different, kind of flip it on its head. I'm struck by how aggressive Mike Pence has been on the policy questions. I don't think he's running on Trumpism without Trump. He's taking Donald Trump on entitlement reform and on foreign policy and national security. If we would have had a conversation in 2017, 2018, what are the ways in which Donald Trump is most broken with Republican orthodoxy over the past 2 decades, we would have probably pointed to size and scope of government, entitlement reform, and foreign policy. Mike Pence is actually articulating this in a way that makes him so different from Donald Trump.
He does it in a low-key way, right, Stephen? I think one of the interesting things about his appeal to Republican voters, though, I think, is this question of civility. Do Republican voters want it? If you think about Trump and what he brought to the Republican Party was, I'm going to beat up on my own Vice President Pence. I'm going to beat up on Mitch McConnell. I'm going to beat up on the Club for Growth. Give me former Speaker Paul Ryan. I'll go at him, too. It didn't matter. And I think that there's a sense of anger, in my own sense, and you feel free to correct me, within the Republican voter ranks that is distrustful and angry at government. And who speaks to it? Well, it's that Donald Trump who's being so disruptive. And when you're talking about Mike Pence or some of these others, you're trying to say, hey, there's a civility of how we all work together in this town. And I don't think it sells.
I think it's a big bet. I do agree with your characterization of it. I mean, I think if you look at the way that Pence is making the early steps of his potential run, what he's saying is people are more sick of Donald Trump and the anger and the craziness, frankly, than they are enamored with the grievance politics that Republicans have practiced for the past 7-8 years. And that's a big bet. It's a big bet.
I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I don't want to get off of the point of entitlements, because I do think it's significant what you say. The fact that the former vice president seems to have a willingness and openness to saying, look, let's discuss entitlements. And yet for so many other politicians, Democrats and Republicans, they see that as the third rail. I mean, look at President Biden made that a fighting point in his State of the Union address.
State of the Union address. And then, former President Trump, he came out and said that entitlement reform is completely off the table and tried to really corner Republicans in that way who have challenged going against it. But you're right, with Mike Pence, that is something that he has taken on.
It's so interesting, Faiz, because Senator Sanders says we need to address the issue of entitlements. We need to make them solvent. I mean, how do you see this playing out? Both in the primary for Republicans and in the general, because at some point it seems like this has to be addressed.
Trump is crazy in many ways, but he's not dumb on this issue. He's got a sense of his own base.
So you think it's risky for Pence?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Donald Trump led his own party to a position in 2016 that was contrary to many decades of Republican thought, which was to say, both on trade deals and entitlement reform, I'm gonna be a different type of Republican. And to this day, I think if he's casting himself still as an iconoclast within the Republican field on those issues, it's going to go well, because I mean, he moved his own Republican base to where he is. Let's talk about another issue where Pence is drawing a line, and that is on Ukraine. I want to play a little bit of the sound and then get your reaction on the other side.
It's the right approach to this moment in history with renewed Russian aggression in Eastern Europe is strength, American strength, and calling on our allies to continue to meet their obligations for our common defense.
So would you say Ron DeSantis' characterization is wrong?
I would say anyone that thinks that Vladimir Putin will stop at Ukraine is wrong.
So, Meredith, there is Pence essentially responding to DeSantis and to Trump, who have questioned the amount of aid that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine. I mean, he is saying, no, we need to stand firmly against Putin and with Ukraine for these democratic values. Again, kind of the traditional Republican perspective when it comes to war.
Yeah, what was so interesting about this speech by Mike Pence was it was reported that he arranged for this speech to happen after DeSantis made those comments about Ukraine as a way to go after them directly and go after this wing of the Republican Party that has been growing in loudness, if you will, for questioning how much money should be going to Ukraine and how we should be thinking about giving help there. And while, according to polls, there is support for Ukraine, Republicans we have seen that some Republicans have shown shrinking support for how much money. And DeSantis said across the board, no blank check. And that's something that we've seen from other Republicans as well.
Stephen, this no blank check, does it neutralize what was once one of the strongest talking points for Republicans?
I mean, I don't know.
We're strong on defense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think that's what Mike Pence is playing to right there. He wants to be able to say we're going to bet on American leadership, and that's what Republicans believe. I mean, Ron DeSantis, when Barack Obama was president, criticized Barack Obama on Ukraine from the other side, said he's not doing enough, this is not nearly robust enough, we have to have American leadership, and was quite critical. Now he's criticizing Joe Biden, saying, in effect, we're doing too much, we shouldn't be doing as much as we are. I think, Ron DeSantis is in the early stages of figuring out, laying out or maybe figuring out his foreign policy worldview. Something bears careful watching.
It sure does. Let's talk about the Democrats, Faiz. Let me ask you about this piece by Greg Craig in the New York Times that urges the Democratic Party to open up the VP race next year. Fascinating. Let me read you a piece of it. He writes, quote, without real campaign activity among Democrats in the lead up to the 2024 election, media coverage of Republican presidential politics will be intense, with regular bashing of Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris, including attacks and conspiracy theories about the president's age and health. Allowing Democratic voters to pick the vice presidential nominee might address the Democrats' enthusiasm gap. If the status quo continues, no one on the Democratic side will excite or inspire a crowd. Giving Democratic voters a role in choosing the VP nominee would inject electricity and drama into an otherwise predictable, if not enervating process. What do you make of that? Are they all but calling for a primary of Biden without calling for a primary?
Yeah, it's a version of that, right? It certainly is. I think this would not be an issue had Vice President Harris performed better in the 2020 primary. And that's one of the things that's hurting her is that she dropped out early, didn't manage the campaign very well, people didn't have a lot of confidence in her. The other thing that's happening is that the Democratic field and voters are moving in a progressive direction. So you have both of these things happening simultaneously in which people are wondering who's the most credible progressive who can win a general election. And I don't think she's made the sale yet to win the confidence of Democratic primary voters on that question, which is why you see this bubbling up in all this different facets and forms.
Meredith, is there any universe in which this would ever happen based on your reporting?
I mean, I don't know. In that same article, they said that's how they did it with FDR.
Yeah.
They picked it that way. So there's a historical precedence. The issue of age is going to be, it's taboo, but it's going to be a huge one in the upcoming election. And Nikki Haley bringing up the competency test, I think this conversation's only just started.
And even President Biden said it's fair game.
Yep.
So there you go. Thank you all for a great conversation. Meredith, Faiz, and Stephen, really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.